Hello, dear viewers. There are already over 100 of you. My goal is to reach 1,000 subscribers on my YouTube channel. If you're interested in this type of content, please subscribe. I would be grateful to you. Thanks. Let's move on to the story. Summer had arrived, and four friends Oleg, Lena, Kostya, and Ira decided to spend the weekend in nature. They had been planning this trip for a long time, choosing the location, stocking up on supplies, and discussing the route. Finally, they settled on a dense forest near a river, a place Oleg had visited with his parents before. The forest was old, mysterious, and in some parts, impassable, which only added to the thrill. They set out early on Saturday morning to reach the spot and set up camp while it was still daylight. The road was long and winding, but the good company made the time fly by. Arriving at the edge of the forest, they unloaded their backpacks, tents, and other gear and headed into the woods. The forest was immersed in a mystical silence, broken only occasionally by birdsong and the rustling of leaves. After a couple of hours, they reached the place where Oleg had camped before. It was a small clearing by the river, surrounded by tall trees that seemed like impenetrable guardians of this secluded spot. The friends set up their tents, lit a fire, and began preparing lunch. They laughed, shared stories, and enjoyed the surroundings. Time flew by, and it soon began to get dark. They decided it was time to have dinner and prepare for the night. Kostya, the most experienced camper, suggested taking turns on night watch to keep the fire going and ensure their safety. The others agreed, and they set up a schedule. Oleg took the first watch. He sat by the fire, gazing at the stars and reflecting on life. Suddenly, he heard a strange sound, as if someone was sneaking through the thick bushes. Oleg tensed up but decided it was probably just forest animals. Soon the sound stopped, and Oleg relaxed, continuing to watch the fire. Lena, Ira, and Kostya were already asleep in their tents when Oleg began to feel uneasy. It seemed to him that someone was watching them. He looked around but saw nothing suspicious. The hours dragged by slowly until Kostya came to relieve him. Oleg was glad to go to the tent and sleep. Kostya was resolute and not easily frightened. He poured himself a cup of coffee and sat by the fire. Suddenly, he heard a rustle in the nearby bushes. Probably a fox, he thought, but decided to check anyway. Taking a flashlight, Kostya slowly walked towards the sound. His footsteps echoed in the night silence as he reached the bushes. There was nothing there except broken branches and dense shrubbery. Kostya was about to return to the fire when he noticed something strange on the ground. It was a small wooden amulet, clearly ancient and covered with mysterious symbols. Kostya picked it up, examined it closely, and decided to take it back to the fire. He sat down and began to study the find by the firelight. The amulet seemed sinister, emanating an aura of ancient magic. Kostya couldn't understand why, but he felt a sense of dread. It was as if something dark and menacing was looming over them, as if the forest had come alive and was watching their every move. When it was time, Kostya woke Ira for her shift. He handed her the amulet and told her about the strange sounds. Ira laughed, saying it was just their imagination and that Kostya needed to sleep. But once alone by the fire, Ira also began to feel something strange. The forest's silence seemed too heavy, and the shadows cast by the fire too long and menacing. Ira sat clutching the amulet when she suddenly heard a loud crack of branches. She jumped up, directing her flashlight towards the sound, and froze. In the beam of the flashlight, she saw the silhouette of a person standing at the edge of the clearing. They didn't move, just stood and watched her. Ira screamed and ran to the tents, waking everyone else. Oleg, Lena, and Kostya rushed out of their tents, armed with flashlights and knives. They searched the entire clearing but found no one. Ira was terrified, but the friends tried to calm her down, convincing her it was just her imagination. However, something in her eyes suggested it was more than just a figment of her imagination. They sat by the fire again, deciding not to separate until morning. No one wanted to be alone. The forest seemed gloomy and grim, darkness thickened, and every sound caused panic. Despite the anxiety, everyone was exhausted and began nodding off. Only Ira remained alert, clutching the amulet like a lifeline. She couldn't shake the feeling that they were surrounded by unseen eyes. The night was quiet, but each of them felt something was terribly wrong. Their peaceful outing had turned into a nightmare, and none of them knew what would happen next. The morning greeted the friends with cool air and a fog that enveloped the forest like a shroud. Oleg, Lena, Kostya, and Ira sat around the campfire, tensely exchanging glances. The anxiety sown by the nighttime incident hadn't left them. Even the rays of the sun piercing through the foliage couldn't dispel the oppressive atmosphere. What was that last night? Lena finally broke the silence. Was it a person or? I don't know, Ira interrupted her. But I definitely saw someone. It couldn't have been just a shadow. Oleg, trying to lighten the mood, suggested they go for a swim in the river to refresh themselves. The friends agreed, hoping the water would help them shake off their fears. They quickly gathered their things and headed to the river, which was not far from their campsite. The river was calm and clear, its transparent waters inviting them to dive in. The friends quickly undressed and jumped into the water. For a while, their fears and anxieties were forgotten, laughter and splashes filled the air. But as soon as they came out of the water, the fog surrounded them again, and they felt they were not alone. Ira once more noticed movement at the edge of the clearing but decided not to raise the alarm, thinking that fatigue and fear were playing tricks on her. They returned to the camp and began preparing breakfast. Everything seemed normal, but something deep inside each of them hinted that this was just an illusion. Oleg, the bravest of the group, suggested exploring the forest. He hoped to find an explanation for what was happening and prove to his friends that there was nothing to fear. The friends agreed, and taking knives and flashlights with them, headed deeper into the forest. The further they went, the thicker the trees became, the darker and gloomier the forest seemed. They walked, trying not to fall behind each other, but the feeling of being watched never left them. Suddenly, Lena stopped and pointed to the ground. In the tall grass, there were footprints deep, human ones. The friends exchanged glances but continued on, following the tracks. The further they went, the more footprints they found. They led to an old, abandoned house standing among the trees. The house seemed to have been deserted for many years. The windows were broken, the roof had caved in, and the walls were overgrown with moss and vines. Oleg was the first to approach the door and push it open. The door creaked open, revealing a grim interior. The friends entered, their flashlights illuminating the dusty and ransacked rooms. Strange symbols, similar to those on the amulet, were visible on the walls. What happened here? Kostya whispered, examining the rooms. Ira, holding the amulet in her hands, felt a strange warmth emanating from it. She intuitively knew the amulet was somehow connected to this place. Suddenly, she was engulfed by a vision. Images of people conducting strange rituals in this house flashed before her eyes. She saw one of them holding the amulet and chanting incomprehensible words. Ira abruptly opened her eyes and recoiled, dropping the amulet. The friends rushed to her, trying to understand what had happened. I saw. Ira stammered. They performed some rituals here. This place is cursed. Oleg picked up the amulet and squeezed it in his hand. He realized the jokes were over. The night in this forest could be their last if they didn't figure out what was happening. He suggested returning to camp to discuss their next steps. The friends reluctantly agreed. Back at the camp, they lit a fire and sat around it. Oleg laid out the found items and began to think aloud. The amulet, the abandoned house, the footprints. It's all connected. We need to understand what kind of rituals were performed here and how it concerns us. Maybe there's something else in the forest that we missed. Maybe we should look in the house again, suggested Lena. We only looked at the upper floor. What if there's a basement? The idea seemed reasonable. Deciding they had no better plan, they agreed to return to the house after lunch. But before they could eat, they heard a noise from the other side of the river. Someone was crashing through the bushes, and the sound was getting closer to the camp. Kostya grabbed a knife and a flashlight, ready for anything. The others followed suit, peering into the forest. The noise grew louder, and suddenly a man burst onto the clearing. He was disheveled, in dirty clothes, with a crazed look in his eyes. "Get out of here," he screamed. "The forest won't let you leave alive." The friends recoiled, not knowing how to react. The man seemed to be in a state of extreme nervous breakdown. He kept shouting, flailing his arms. "Spirits dwell here. They watch you. They hunt you. You have to go. You must leave." Oleg, trying to calm the man, approached him slowly. "Who are you? What happened to you?" The man looked at Oleg, his eyes filled with terror. I came here with my friends. We found the house, the amulet, and then they came for us. I'm the only one left. You must leave, or they'll take you too. Suddenly, a loud crack echoed from the forest, followed by another rustle. The man's eyes widened in horror. He turned and ran back into the woods, disappearing as quickly as he had appeared. The friends stood frozen, trying to process what had just happened. The forest was silent again, but now it seemed even more sinister. They realized they had to make a decision: stay and try to uncover the mystery, or leave immediately to save their lives. "We need to go," Lena said, her voice trembling. "We can't stay here." "But what if it follows us?" Kostya objected. "What if we need to end it here?" Oleg looked at the amulet, feeling its weight in his hand. He knew Kostya was right. Running might not save them. They had to find out what was going on and put an end to it. "We stay," Oleg decided. "We go back to the house and find that basement. It's our only chance." With heavy hearts, the friends prepared to return to the house, knowing that the night would bring even greater horrors. Night descended swiftly and mercilessly, enveloping the forest in impenetrable darkness. The friends sat by the fire, trying not to stray too far from one another. The fire's glow cast eerie shadows on their faces, making them look grim and exhausted. They felt that danger was close and tried to stay alert. Oleg, Lena, Kostya, and Ira sat in silence, tensely listening to the night sounds. It seemed that the forest had come to life, emitting strange, frightening rustles and whispers. The amulet that Oleg held suddenly became hot, as if influenced by invisible forces. This added to their anxiety and made their hearts beat faster. "We can't just sit here and wait," Oleg finally said, looking at his friends. "We need to do something. Maybe if we deal with this amulet, everything will stop." "But what can we do? We don't even know what we're dealing with," Lena asked, her voice trembling. "Maybe we should go back to that house and try to find the basement, as you suggested," Kostya interjected. "There might be answers there." Ira remained silent, her gaze fixed on the amulet. She intuitively felt that this object was the key to everything that was happening, but she also understood that the solution might cost them their lives. "I agree," Ira finally said. "We need to go back to the house. I had a vision, and it involved the basement. Maybe there we'll find what can help us get out of here." The friends got up, gathered their things, and headed to the house, leaving the fire burning. Their path was illuminated only by the weak beams of their flashlights, which seemed insignificant in this dark and ominous forest. The silence was oppressive, and every step echoed in their heads. When they reached the house, the fear and anxiety intensified. The old abandoned house looked even more sinister in the moonlight. Oleg was the first to enter, holding the amulet in front of him like a protective talisman. The others followed closely behind, staying close to one another. They began searching for the entrance to the basement. The floor creaked under their feet, and it seemed that the walls were whispering something incomprehensible. Finally, Kostya found an old door hidden behind a shelf. He opened it, revealing a narrow staircase leading into darkness. "Let's go," Oleg said decisively, and started down. The friends followed him, clutching their flashlights and knives. The staircase led to a damp and gloomy basement, where the smell of mold and mustiness filled the air. Their steps echoed in the confined space. Finally, they found themselves in a large room, its walls covered with the same symbols as the amulet. In the center of the room stood an altar, upon which lay old books and ritual objects. Oleg approached it and saw a book open to a page with the image of the amulet and a description of a ritual. He began to read aloud. "This amulet is linked to the forest spirits. It can evoke their wrath if used improperly. To lift the curse, a cleansing ritual must be performed using the blood of the one who activated the amulet." "This is madness," Lena whispered, her eyes filled with fear. "We can't do this." "But we have no choice," Oleg said firmly. "If we don't, the spirits will kill us." Ira approached Oleg and took the amulet. She felt she could handle the ritual. "I'll do it," she said. "I feel that I can." Oleg began preparing everything needed for the ritual. They placed the items on the altar, lit the candles, and drew a circle on the floor, following the instructions from the book. Ira stood in the center of the circle with the amulet in her hands, ready to chant the incantations. Suddenly, shadows began to emerge from the darkness of the basement. They surrounded the friends, whispering in an ancient language and drawing closer. The spirits, summoned by the amulet, thirsted for revenge. Ira started chanting, her voice trembling but determined. At that moment, the shadows attacked. Oleg, Lena, and Kostya found themselves in a deadly trap, surrounded by the sinister spirits. Kostya tried to protect Ira, but the shadows pounced on him, tearing at his flesh and leaving bloody marks. He screamed in pain, falling to the floor, his cries echoing through the basement. Lena tried to help, but she too was attacked, soon losing consciousness from the terror and pain. Oleg, desperately fighting off the shadows, saw his friends falling one by one under the onslaught of the malevolent entities. He knew time was running out. Ira continued the ritual, her voice growing weaker. She knew this was their last chance for salvation. As Ira uttered the final words of the incantation, the amulet began to glow brightly, blinding everyone in the basement. The shadows froze in place, their whispers ceased. It seemed the ritual had worked. But at that moment, Ira felt a sharp pain in her chest. She looked down and saw her body beginning to disappear, as if dissolving into the air. No, Oleg screamed, rushing to Ira, but it was too late. The amulet demanded a sacrifice, and Ira became that sacrifice. She vanished, leaving only the amulet on the floor. The shadows also disappeared, leaving the basement in eerie silence. Oleg was left alone, surrounded by the bodies of his friends. He realized that salvation had come too late. He picked up the amulet and felt its power wane. The curse had been lifted, but the price was too high. Oleg left the basement, feeling life slipping away from him. He knew he would never forget this horror, and the forest would always haunt his nightmares. When he reached the camp, the sky was already starting to lighten. He sat by the extinguished fire, staring into the ashes. Tears streamed down his face, but he couldn't stop them. His friends had died, and he couldn't save them. Hours passed, and rescuers arrived at the clearing, summoned by relatives worried about their prolonged absence. They found Oleg in a state of shock, unable to speak. The forest had claimed its victims, leaving only one witness to the horror. Oleg would forever be haunted by the memory of that night, when the forest came to life and took his friends. He knew he would never find peace, and the shadows would follow him to the end of his days. The forest's curse would never release him,